Retro.
Yeah.
Electro. Tech.
Oh yeah.
Hey, turn the lights back on. Wow. Retro electro tech. When real audio ruled the world.
Well, hello there once again, ladies and gentlemen. This is Retro Ernest of Retro Electro Tech. Here on the bench, I'm servicing the Onkyo P304 preamp that came into the shop as a pair with the Onkyo M504, which of course is the main amplifier. So both of these units came in as a working pair, but the customer wants me to go through and inspect his equipment, carefully go through and make sure that there isn't any components that look like they've seen better days. I talk about that sometimes as bulging electrolytic capacitors, electrolytics that are leaking their electrolyte from around the base. Sometimes you'll see that. Components that look stressed as far as overheated, discolored, charred, all that kind of stuff. You know, look for funky wiring, connection issues, whatever looks out of sorts. So on that note, of course, I'm not going to go through a long laundry list of things that I look for, but I bring it up often that my primary course of action is to start with going through and doing a cursory inspection, and as I work inside of a unit in a particular area that I'm focusing in on, then I'm going to look a second time, look a third time, and just really make sure that I don't miss anything, because, you know, I'm a human being, and, you know, I don't always hone in on everything the first time. So that's why it's a good idea to not stop at just one pass. Of course, in an effort to bring up the overall reliability factor of the equipment, I'm always going to recommend starting with the power supply. I bring this up all the time, and I can't emphasize that enough, because, you know, this is 30-something-year-old equipment, but on a daily basis I deal with equipment that's 30-something, 40-something, 50-something, or more years old. You know, it's a good idea to do what you can within the customer's budget to take care of obvious things that are usually where most of the problems crop up from. You know, power supplies, because a power supply is subjected to more demand, electrical wear and tear. So hit the power supply areas and service the controls. Let me go ahead and hone in on the controls a little bit closer. So there's multiple you know, switches that I'm going to take a look at, of course, and service. Some pots and, you know, more switches. So as a matter of course, you know, I like to go through, those of you who watch the channel, I like to go through, and in this case, being that the switches and controls, from what I could see during the function testing that I have performed thus far, are looking pretty good. It's not going to hurt to go in and give them a servicing, a flushing, and a little bit of a relube as needed, where needed. That's all good. And another course of action in this unit is, you know, the input board here. We have all these. I'm of course going to clean the inputs. I always do that anyways on any piece of equipment. I clean the inputs, freshen up everything there. Oh, also too, I always mention it, but I go through and check solder joints on board, see if I come across anything that really stands out, and then I look again to see if I'm missing anything and hone in on a little bit more detail. I'm going to do that to the best of my ability with the time that I have to work on this. So anyways, these switches here, okay, hopefully that's in view. Let me peek at the screen. Yeah. Okay, so all these switches here, these selector switches, I'm going to service them, gain some access, and let me go ahead and change camera views, because I want to show you the layout, how the linkages and all that are arranged that control the switches. So let me go ahead and do that. So what you're looking at are the linkage bars that extend over to those switch plungers that I just pointed out. Okay, and this is the end here that made up with those switch plungers, and then there's some of these connectors here. Okay, little screw connectors, if you will, that connect up with the shafts here of these little plungers here. Okay, and this plate here mounts to the front of the unit, and again these linkage bars connect up like so. Okay, like so, and extend over to the input selector switches there. So, you know, there's a little bit of involvement there, and no rocket science, no real rocket science, but it's just a little song and dance you have to go through to, you know, have access to everything, and, you know, get the that input selector board removed. Let me go ahead and switch back over to that board there. Okay, maybe kick up the exposure a couple notches. All right. So yeah, so that's where those linkages and all that tie in, is to these switches. So I'm going to, you know, again, clean the input jacks, the selector switches, you know, recap and freshen up the power supply sections, tolerance check components within reason, and just go through and do the best I can. And at least that will bring up the reliability of this unit. Okay, so I'm going to get to servicing these controls. I'm going to start with these potentiometers and move over to the switches. And I'll just kind of, you know, chit-chat a little bit while I'm going through the process of flushing these out. So on my can of contact cleaner, I have this straw that extends over to this hooked needle applicator, so that I can reach over the pots in this case and gain access into the openings, the ports. It helps to have, you know, a little hooked applicator, and it just makes life a little bit easier. You know, the old saying, work smarter, not harder. I mean, I work hard enough as it is. Oops, straw popped off. There's a reason why you want to wear goggles when you do this, and gloves. I didn't get that one in the eye, but I could have if being that the straw popped off right at that moment. It could have backfired on me and got me in the eye. Some of you did used to watch that show Alice. As a matter of fact, that gal just passed away. You know, Mal's Diner. You remember Flo? Yeah, I remember, because I have that kind of a memory. I remember a scene where some dude sitting in the diner that Flo was waiting on, I think, pinched her on the booty, and she turned around him and just about smacked him and said, "Honey, I'm like a grapefruit. You squeeze me in the wrong place, you're going to get it right in the eye." Yeah. So anyways, I bring that up because I almost got it right in the eye, or I could have with this contact cleaner. So point is, wear eye protection. So I'm going to work my way down anyways, and you know, hit these. Okay, let me see. There we go. And just work them over and over and over again. Rotate the shafts back and forth so that the wiper contact, you know, just moves back and forth on the resistive track, and with the aid of the contact cleaner, kind of carves out a nice clean path. Now with these controls, because they're mostly in good shape, I'm not real concerned about, you know, how they're going to respond. I know they're going to respond favorably because, like I said, this is a functioning piece of equipment. I'm just freshening things up. But when I talk about connection issues a lot, that I go through and I check solder joints and wiring and all these plug and socket type connectors and so forth, and I talk about connection issues, for some cats that are a little newer to this, getting into this, connection issues also encompass these controls and switches, because within these controls and switches, these pots and switches, are are of course contacts. And we have the wiper contacts that are making contact with the resistive tracks, the contact points and switches. So problems with connection issues can involve pots and switches. That's where I'm going with it. And this stuff is just rinse and repeat. I repeat this stuff over and over and over again to the point where I get tired of it. Well, on camera explaining it, because I feel like I'm constantly repeating myself, which I am. These are common problems. I really like to go through and do an inspection before I start arriving at conclusions that I'm going to have to go in and get into more extensive diagnostics with sussing out a problem in the signal path with something cutting out and getting intermittent because of a transistor that's getting ready to poop the bed. Although those are common problems as well, but connection issues kind of lead the way when it comes to a lot of this old equipment that's 30-something, 40-something, 50-something years old, like I said. So, and dirty controls are a big part of that. So that's why I repeat this stuff over and over again, because there's always new people that are checking out videos that may not have heard me talk about this before. So I have to, repeat myself. So, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep on, going, back and forth just a couple more times, let those dry out, and then eventually I'll put a little drop of fader lube in there, work them again, and I will come back when I'm going to work on these. Let me actually pan down a little bit. When I'm going to work on these switches here. These are, for the most part, sealed switches. So in the case of these switches that are sealed, some of these types of switches actually have the rear of the switches open. These don't. So what I typically do is get a little pin vise or Archimedes drill and just carefully with a tiny bit, just small enough or big enough, whatever, but a small bit nonetheless, that will allow me to get this a little needle applicator into it and just really flush out the switch while I'm working these switches over and over again as well. So there's things that a person really needs to know so as to not cause damage to the switch, and I'll touch on that in a little bit when I get into it. But I'm working on these pots first, and then once I'm all done with these, then I'll do the switches, and input jacks and everything. Again, I'm taking care of potential connection problems first, freshening all that up, and then I'm going to go into some recapping in the power supply. So I'll be back in just a moment. All right, before I get into servicing the switches that I pointed out just a moment ago, which are your typical run-of-the-mill, again, you got to move these boards carefully, no hurry, but these typical run-of-the-mill switches, these plastic rectangular switches and all that. Now these are fairly straightforward. These switches are a different animal. Now this one appears to be sealed up really good. You might be able to kind of dodge a bullet, if you will, and find an opening if you look around, maybe enough to dribble in some contact cleaner. If there was something intermittent going on with the contacts internally, they were a bit tarnished, just with age or whatever the case. Now, because these are sealed, they typically don't have as many issues with dirt working its way in and dust and all that, but still, because they have a plunger on the front and because there are some little cracks here and there, over time, yes, they can still internally become dirty and start becoming intermittent, or depending on the environment they're in and all that, the internal contacts could become tarnished. So there may be a need to access them, or just wear and tear or an internal defect. There's a few different possibilities if you think your way through it as to what could be going on with a switch. However, because of the way these switches are made, obviously there's a mechanism within them that is moving this ribbon, that's sliding this ribbon and controlling a switch on another board, and I'll point that out in a little bit. So you can't really just start drilling an access hole into these switches without understanding what might be underneath. So you don't want to cause damage, and run that risk. If you're going to service a switch like this because you absolutely have to, then you're going to want to remove it from the board. You're going to want to have full access to it. In other words, remove it, take it on as kind of a separate project outside the unit, so you have a nice clear shot at things. You're able to negotiate the switch, figure out how it functions, and what the best course of action is as far as disassembling it. You want to do that and look before you leap and really understand the switch. So I'm not encouraging somebody who's just getting into servicing this equipment to go into a switch like this. And these type of switches with linkages on them and all that, sometimes they're a bit more straightforward. There's different makes of them, different styles, series, makes of them and all that. Some are easier to access than others, and some are very difficult. They really weren't made to be serviced and pulled apart. If you do that, you run the risk of damaging the switch, and trying to find a switch like this is not going to be the easiest thing on planet Earth. You might find one that's been parted out from a unit, but these are typically not sitting on shelves in stores or on websites. So, again, you might run across a replacement, but when you go into a switch like this, then you better move slow, and I'm really emphasizing this because this isn't the type of switch, again, you want to drill an access hole and start spraying it out, because of the way it's constructed internally in order to operate the, the little linkage, the slide, this little sliding linkage, ribbon band, whatever you want to call it. So, anyways, that's that. So look before you leap. Whereas, this is your typical run-of-the-mill switch that I'm referring to, these rectangular switches, plastic switches that we see in a lot of amps and receivers, okay? So, and I just pointed those out, but they're essentially the same across the board. And there might be little differences here and there, so you have to approach all of this very cautiously so as not to damage stuff. But you remember earlier I was saying that I will typically, and let me get some kind of a pointer. Okay, so you recall that I mentioned when I really need to get into one of these switches that is otherwise sealed, at least to the point where I can't get a good steady flow of contact cleaner through it and really flush it out, then I want to, gain access to it. And sometimes you need to. It's a good idea to get in there and maintenance these when needed, or in this case, I'm going to freshen things up. And I'm confident in my understanding and ability to do this without damaging a control. So where I'm pointing, you want to get as close to the rear of the switch as possible. I mean, you don't want to go right to the edge, but just a little bit back, and with a very small drill bit and a little pin vise, because you're not going to use a powered drill and pop your way through and cause damage. And you just move through a little at a time, and I'm going to demonstrate that. But here's what I mean by these switches. So I'm going to kick the exposure way down, and I'm going to get a little flashlight behind that switch. You starting to see what I see? Okay, let me get my other finger over the top here. You see the switch is now a little bit translucent, right? With that light behind it. You see that shuttle inside moving about? Well, if you have the switch pushed in, it's a bit closer to the end of the switch. With this particular switch, though, you still have a little bit of a gap there, so you have that little safety margin where if you drill in a little access hole in the top, you're not going to hit that shuttle here. Now I'm holding it right there. Now the switch is off. So you see I have a big wide gap when it's off. So that's why you want the switches out, or off, whatever, or out in the out position, because that gives you some leeway there. Most of these switches of this type are that way. And when you have them on, you have a little bit less of a gap. Have them off. Of course, if I was holding it in, you never want to hold it in while you're drilling, obviously. But that's my point, and that's why I say, you can kind of see in a switch like this, if you shine a light through it and you can kind of illuminate it a little bit, you can kind of see the structures within it. Now that works with some of these plastic switches, but you're not gonna be able to see through a metal one. But that's what I mean by planning your entry, I guess, into a switch. And that's why, now let me get the exposure back up again. All right, but that's why I recommend drilling toward the rear and being very careful not to push any plastic little shavings or plastic dust into the switch. Not that a little tiny bit that falls in is going to affect the switch, because when you're drilling very carefully and you're brushing aside little pieces of plastic debris, yeah, when you finally pop through, there might be a little tiny plastic, I guess, dust, as opposed to big large shavings that might enter just a little bit. But by the time you flush the inside of the switch, yeah, it's not going to get in the way of any sort of movement within that switch. It's not going to cause any problems. I've done it a million times. You just don't want to push any large plastic shavings into the hole and just be reckless and just drill through and push everything in. So as you move through, and I'm going to demonstrate it, that's what you're going to do. You're going to be brushing little shavings and dust aside as you're pushing through until you finally pop through very carefully. So let me go ahead and demonstrate what I'm talking about. Okay, so what I recommend is that if you've never done this before, and I use this little Archimedes drill that you kind of, you just kind of pump it up and down, and the drill bit spins there, and that's all. And let me, brush away any. Sometimes I use a brush, but I have this blower too that just to clear away. Okay, before I pop through. And let me see, I believe I just popped through, and that's it. No problem. So now I just want to go in and give it a little, try not to get in the way of the camera with my hand, but let's see. And I just kind of flood the cavity somewhat with contact cleaner. Work the switch over again. And let the contact cleaner do its work, and get in there between the contacts and freshen things up a bit, okay? And what I will do after all that's said and done, the hole that I just made, being that this is a fairly sealed up switch, I'll usually put a little, you can even use just a little piece of a tiny piece of tape if you want, or I have somewhere, where the heck do I have them? But I have little tape dots, they're called, and I'll put a picture up on the screen, but they come adhered to sheets. You can buy them in sheets, and they have a bunch of little tape dots that you can just peel and stick on there. So if they have to be serviced again down the road, you just peel the sticker off, but at the same time you can seal up that hole so that little pieces of dust and crap won't work their way in over time. And that's the key, over time, because these switches don't get intermittent overnight. So as I always say, no rocket science there. And with these type of switches, I'm going to repeat the process, get them flushed out, seal them up with a tape dot. And on that note, I always try to make it look nice, even though it's not critical. There isn't big old pieces of tape, looks all Beverly Hillbilly and all that crap. It's done neatly. I pay attention to those kind of details. That's just my process. Yours might vary, and that's fine. That's all there is to it, really. I almost forgot to point out these switches that are also fed by these cables here. Now these are a lot easier to service in terms of just getting contact cleaner in them because of their openings, as you can see along the along the sides here. So you can see as I rotate these are for the selector switches. Okay, you can see that moving in and out. Yeah, because these are open, like I said, in other words, dust gets in there. These are more likely to have problems with intermittent contacts and all that if dust and crap works its way in. And when you're moving these around, by the way, be careful. Some of these chassis are pretty sharp. You can see I sliced my finger open here. So nobody can say that Retro Ernest doesn't put his blood into this. But anyways, yeah, no big deal. Inside it's hard to see, but there's a black shuttle or a body that slides across the contacts. And if I lower it down in reference to this top hole here, if I lower the shuttle down, then I'll get my contact cleaner applicator in there. Give it a good blast. There we go. Get that out of there. And then just exercise the control like I always do. That way, you know, we're getting a nice little scrubbing action going on there between the contact points, and of course aided by the contact cleaner. And I'll flush those out a few times because we don't want any intermittency in our selector switches or whatever the case. Get these all nice and cleaned out. So there you go. All right, and here is yet another switch. This is the cartridge selector switch for moving magnet, moving coil. But anyways, I drilled another little access hole here, okay, toward the rear of the unit so that we avoid drilling into that little contact carrier or, you know, the body of the switch internally. So remember to have that switch disengaged if you're going to attempt this, and some switches may be different than others, so again you have to think your way through. Another thing too is right now I don't have the unit turned up on its side to position it for drainage because it's easier for me just to access what I accessed with the unit laying flat. Not real important, but I like to normally position things for drainage so that I don't get solvent all over the board, but you'll notice I have cotton tucked in here. I don't know if I pointed that out earlier when I was working on some other switches, maybe not. However, a little bit of cotton tucked down in here. It only takes a second to do that. You have a little cotton around, you just tuck it in there carefully. Obviously we all have to use common sense and we don't want to push too hard and damage a component soldered to the board. But anyways, cotton is very absorbent, as we know, so it's a good material to lay down there. It'll absorb a lot of that solvent that's pouring out of the switch. So I'm just going to get my applicator in there, and you can see that switch flooding with solvent, and that's what I want. I get a good flush going on, and then I'll exercise the switch. Keep on doing that over and over and over again, and let those contacts scrub and all that. And then, like I said, when I'm done, I'm going to seal up that hole. So I just wanted to point that out once again, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. So now that I completed the servicing of the controls and this lovely preamp, I want to throw out a disclaimer, before I start prepping up to recap the power supply. I want to throw out a disclaimer concerning the method I just covered in this video, and I've covered it in other videos as well. And that's about establishing a very small access hole in the body of the switches that I pointed out. Okay, so I'm mostly directing this to the newcomer servicing such equipment, or wants to service this equipment, or of course anyone who's interested in this stuff. And what I want to say is, are there risks? Yes, of course. But as I mentioned earlier, if you attempt it, you just have to think your way through. Okay, you have to understand what you're doing before you drill through. And I pointed out a little bit earlier, I kind of showed you, I put a flashlight beam behind one of those switches, and you can kind of see the carrier, the contact carrier or shuttle, whatever, that moves back and forth in the switch, which, we can see there was that hollow void in there, that cavity. So stuff like that, you have to kind of know what you're getting into before you get into it. And one of the potential issues that I brought up earlier was that if you were to drive too much residue, in other words, the material that you're drilling through, into the switch cavity, you of course run the risk of introducing an obstruction into its path of travel, and you don't want to do that. Big no-no. So I emphasize again, that's why I move very slow through the process with like a pin vise or Archimedes drill, the one that I think you saw me use it, that type of drill, while I sweep, blow, or vacuum away the residue as I move through. and I go through literally one thin layer at a time. Another very important note is before the drill bit pops through, the field of its rotation will change and there will be a little bit of resistance. So just be aware of that. And when you meet that resistance, move slow, move gingerly, and cut all the way through with your bit, again, very slowly, so that you avoid, producing any large shavings, as well as just kind of popping through in, one big push that can cause damage to the switch. And yeah, there might be some horror stories out there, somebody who bodged up a switch pretty bad or whatever. I mean, things do happen, but I've serviced a large number of these and similar switch types, and I've never once experienced any issues with, one seizing up or feeling all rough and gritty. So it really comes down, I think, like with everything, to doing the job right. Just, in other words, taking your time. And another thing to consider on the topic of whether or not a little minuscule amount of perhaps plastic dust or even a tiny shaving will or will not seize up a switch or cause it to run really rough and gritty is the fact that although these switches are fairly delicate, we're not dealing with internal tolerances that are as tight as a baby gnat's butthole, so much so that you can't even pass a fine eyelash through. I'm not going to say with 100% certainty that something bad can't ever happen, because if you introduce a big enough shaving into the cavity and it works its way, under or gets wedged in between the wall of the cavity and maybe that shuttle, perhaps contact carrier, yeah, maybe there could be some problems. But again, I've never worked recklessly enough to drive large pieces of shavings inside of the switch, so I really don't know. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. And on that topic, I should mention that although these switches are somewhat sealed, I referred to them as such earlier. Well, they kind of are, and that helps with bigger pieces of, debris and all that garbage. But they're certainly not impervious to minuscule fragments of the real outside world entering in. Especially when we're talking about decades of time that these switches have been sitting in this gear in different environments, exposed to varying levels of humidity, airborne contaminants, smoke, whatever, the list goes on. But yeah, these little metal contacts in these switches do get tarnished. They do, whatever. So, they're not hermetically sealed, vacuum sealed, or otherwise void of atmosphere. That said, I see these types of switches exhibit intermittent behavior, noisy behavior. So that's why I recommend that they're serviced, even if they're not exhibiting that, because they commonly do. So I'm just going to stop here. I just wanted to mention that, and I want to move on to getting the power supply prepped up so I can get these caps out. There's that white hard glue that I'm going to have to contend with and coax these caps out of here. So I'll be back in just a moment to tackle that. Oh, and one last thing I want to mention before I do that is, by no means am I implying this is a be-all and end-all method to service these switches. There's other methods, I won't get into them. And if you're not confident or sure about gaining access into a switch using the method that I use and others that use this method choose to use, then simply don't do it. But anyways, let's go ahead and move on. All right, so I'm pulling out the old caps, the ones that are glued down first, and that's what I'm going to show here before I end up concluding this. And the best way to get this, get these caps out when you're dealing with this hard white glue is just heat it up. You can use solvents too. You can try to soften things up with some alcohol or something like that. There's different things. If you look it up, there's sources out there. I can't cover everything, but the best way is just heat. So I'm just using one of these hot air tools here. Okay, one of these little China Deluxe hot air tools, which is fine for me. The amount of SMD work that I do, I do it here and there, of course, but not a whole lot of it. But I like this thing more for like heat shrink tubing and stuff like this. But anyways, it works really well. And let me go ahead and kick up the temperature, and we'll just get to it. I already obviously desoldered the caps from the bottom side. Just be careful working your way around you know, the various components and all that. So I just want to soften things up. I don't want to burn any wires or heat up any components more than need be. And that just came right out. Okay, so there you go. And you don't have to spend all day heating this stuff up, just enough. Soften things up. Come on, there we go. Okay, there's another one. And last but not least, gotta watch that rectifier there. They're looking good. All right. And you'll still hear it humming in the background, going through its cool down cycle. And in case you want to know what hot air tool that is, it's one of these. They're super common, these little Chinese units here. But you know, I'll be honest with you, it works good. It does what I need it to do and all that jazz. So I just mainly wanted to get that out. These are some of the caps that are going in, but I have others on order, values that I didn't have, so that's cool. I'll just get in what I can now. And I'm going to end this video here. Like I said, this is a working unit. If I discover any issues that I need to go through and suss out or whatever, I'll deal with it at that time. But everything is doing good with this. I'm just going to get this power supply, you know, these power supply sections, like I said, freshened up a bit. But otherwise, once I get this recapped, it's done. It's going home. So I'm going to end this video here. And like I always say, guys, peace, love, music, and the vintage audio that brings it to your ears. Till next time, y'all take care.
This is a poor man's shoe production.